First of all, thanks everyone for coming out for the public presentation here of the National Petroleum Council's Enhancing Emergency Preparedness for Natural Disasters. My name is Keith Benish. I'm the Program Director for International Climate Policy here at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. And it's my honor tonight to introduce our speaker. Peggy Montana is Executive Vice President of U.S. Pipeline, and in this role she has responsibility for the U.S. Pipeline Business and Services Regional Business Director for the Americas. And Peggy is also CEO, President, and Board of Director for Shell Midstream Partners. Shell Midstream Partners was formed as a vehicle to own, operate, develop, and acquire pipelines and other midstream assets. Peggy's career at Shell spans 38 years, beginning as a chemical engineer in refining. In 2001, she became General Manager, Distribution for Shell's Asia-Pacific business based in Singapore, and was a board member of Shell Pakistan. Following assignments as Vice President of Supply USA and Vice President of Global Distribution, Peggy became Executive Vice President, Supply and Distribution in 2009. And Peggy is Shell's representative on the American Petroleum Institute Downstream Committee and has just finished leading a study on the emergency preparedness for the U.S. National Petroleum Council, which she will be talking about for us this evening. She's also a member of the Advisory Council of the Women's Energy Network and serves on the board of the Houston YMCA. Also speaking tonight will be Robert Hallman, who's one of our fellows at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He has over 30 years of experience in energy and environmental policy and legal matters. And most recently, Mr. Hallman served as Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment for the New York State Governor, Andrew Cuomo, with responsibility for 8 state entities, including the Public Service Commission, Department of Environmental Conservation, the New York Power Authority, and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Immediately prior to joining Governor Cuomo, he directed the energy and environmental practice, national and international in scope, at the law firm of Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell with offices in New York, Washington, D.C., and London, and served as chair of the board of the nonpartisan New York League of Conservation Voters. Earlier in his career, Mr. Hallman served as Deputy Commissioner and General Counsel of DEC, Deputy General Counsel of the United States Department of Energy, and Special Counsel for Energy and Environmental Matters for the New York State Assembly. He is a member of the bars of New York, the District of Columbia and Colorado, the Executive Committee of the Environmental Law Section of the New York Bar, and the International Environmental and Resources Law Committee of the American Bar Association, and has been listed among New York super lawyers in the International's who's who of environmental lawyers. And so with that, I would like to invite Peggy up to present the findings from this very important study. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to it.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks for everybody for showing up. Let me go ahead and start. The National Petroleum Council is an organization you may not be familiar with. It was actually started in World War II as the industry worked with the U.S. federal government and wanted to continue that cooperation going forward. So its sole purpose is actually to advise the Secretary of Energy by conducting studies at his or her request. And so it is a federally chartered advisory committee. It's got a broad range of members. Most of them are obviously oil and natural gas industry members, various places along the supply chain, but it also includes academia as well as others. And Jason Bordoff from Columbia is a member and was a participant in the study. So at Secretary Moniz's request, and this is the request that launched the study, we were asked to study what vulnerabilities have the recent storm activity exposed in U.S. energy infrastructure, and the study actually really was spawned after Superstorm Sandy. And then what legal, procedural, and physical gaps need to be addressed by industry and government to improve the response to disruptions, and what strategies should be pursued to increase energy system resilience to storms and other potential disruptions. And then importantly, I think what actions should be taken to address the interdependencies, and in particular, the interdependency between the oil and gas industry and the utilities, because basically they feed us and we feed them. And so that interdependent nature has had its implications in some of these events. We took that study and put together a scope, very busy slide. But the key messages are that we basically broke into 3 areas of focus. One is around the oil, natural gas, and NGL supply chains. One was clearly around communications and coordination during these events, and then the legal and regulatory frameworks and how could they be improved to speed up the response. A couple of key things about the study, about what it is not. It is not a study that addressed hardening of infrastructure, and I think in due course or in pretty short order, the Department of Energy will release a quadrennial energy report, which does look at that infrastructure aspect and has had input from the industry. The other thing that it addressed was solely focused on natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, fires, that sort of thing. But I think in reality, the recommendations could be used to address other emergency situations, but it was primarily focused on natural disasters. This is just how we were organized. We had a study committee. My boss, Marvin Odom with Shell, led that with the government co-chairs, the Deputy Secretary Poneman, and then succeeded by Deputy Secretary Liz Sherwood Randall. We actually had Bill White, who was the mayor of Houston during some of the hurricanes, was also a member of the executive committee on the study, as was the CEO of Marathon, Gary Heminger, and the CEO of Williams, Greg Armstrong. And then myself and Paula Gant from the DOE led the coordinating subcommittee with the various work streams. We took two approaches to the study to gather the information and the experience and expertise that was out there. The first thing we did was actually go back and look at all the events that have happened and the various after-action reports and studies that have been done looking back at these events and what were the learnings, what were the recommendations coming out of them. The second was to go out and gather the experience and expertise of people who had been through various events and had things that they had learned or had put in place that they thought were working well. And that included the cabinet agencies at the federal government, the Department of Transportation, DHS, DOE, EPA, and a number of others. A good participation from the state governments, from various states. Obviously the oil and gas industry, but also the utilities, again, to help us with this interdependency between the oil and gas industry and the utilities. I think the single biggest thing that came out of these engagements that we took forward was, in particular, looking at the events that had occurred and some of the recommendations that were coming out. Plus also what we were hearing from the engagement sessions is we saw a very high repetition of learnings and findings over and over again, a lot of the same recommendations being put forward as things that were still not working. And while there were incremental improvements after each of these events, there were still some systemic things that hadn't really been put in good enough shape to keep sustained. And so that was a key learning for us, because I'll be the first one to say that I don't think the recommendations that you're going to see are necessarily earth-shattering or in some cases groundbreaking, although there are some very significant points to it. The key is actually going to be in the implementation, and I'll talk a little bit about that, because it's about sustaining, putting in place the operational framework and then being able to sustain it, which is actually going to make the difference. So what were the findings? First and foremost was understanding of the oil and gas supply chains is critical, and we don't mean that everybody needs to be an expert. That's not the intent. But when you've got the communication going back and forth in these events at critical times, some basic understanding of what's the industry look like from a supply chain, so that you can actually communicate back and forth is actually critical. One of the things that we saw in Superstorm Sandy was that there was a lack of understanding about how the oil and natural gas industry is actually run and the regulatory environment under which it operates. What do I mean by that? It's a very fragmented industry now. We're in, decades past, it was a few majors and you could call on them and they could kind of give you the way the landscape was. That's not the case anymore. Most of the retail stations are owned by individual operators. Terminals are run independently as independent terminal operations. And so it's a very fragmented industry. You can't get a hold of 1, 2, 5, or 6 people to kind of give you the feel of what's going on. So that's an issue. There was frustration on that on who to reach out to talk to. There was also, when they reached somebody in the industry that was running a pipeline or running a terminal that stored product, they wanted to have the conversation about how much product did you have on hand, and they wanted to talk about reallocating schedules or stocks. The pipeline operators and terminal operators don't own that stock. They actually can't make those decisions. And so that lack of understanding of how the industry operates and who owns what in the system and the regulatory environment, one point of frustration. Somebody said, well, who are your shippers? Actually, the regulatory requirements for Interstate Commerce Act says pipeline and terminal operators can't tell you who their shippers are. It's private information. So that just creates an incredible amount of frustration, communication breakdown, and lack of speed in dealing with the emergency. So that's some of the things that we were faced with in trying to make the recommendations going forward. Critical to any understanding of the or response to an emergency is understanding what the situation is. What's broken? How long is it going to take to get fixed? What help do you need? And those are that's a situational awareness more than information. A lot of times the information goes out to the industry asking you, how much stock do you have on hand, and how long is when's it going to be that you're going to be out? That's not enough information to make a judgment on, and you need to give more of the situation and information rather than just data. I talked about the fragmentation of the industry, so that is a barrier to effective communication. You've got to reach out to a number of people. The other key thing was that these events don't happen very often. And so once you put that operational framework in place, you've got to sustain it. There's lots of turnover, both in governments and in industry. And so you've got new people in new roles all the time. If they're not trained, if they don't understand their role, then it's a lost cause when the event actually happens. And to maintain that system once it's up and operating does require both leadership commitment and funding to keep that sustained process in place. So the recommendations are really based in 2 key parts. One is about putting that operational framework in place, and the second is then how do you sustain it? How does it keep on going so that when it's needed, it's up, ready, trained, and responsive? The first order of business was to put the operational framework in place, and particularly where we focused at was the federal level and the state level. We really weren't trying to address sort of boots on the ground, the local events. But as issues come up that the local situation can't handle, that's when issues get escalated and states need to respond and the federal government needs to respond to take the barriers out of the way that exists. And so that was really the focus of this study. So the DOE is actively working, and we've seen this as we've gone through the study. They've put a lot of resources and stressed getting the DOE's emergency response team fully up, functional, roles understood, and trained. The one key thing for this industry, and in terms of effective communication and knowledge, was the EIA's role in an emergency response. The EIA is the agency within the DOE that actually usually reaches out to the oil and natural gas industry. They collect our data so that, when you see crude stocks are rising in a particular week, they're the ones that are collecting that data and feeding it forward about the stock positions for crude and products. They know the industry very well. They know how it operates. They know who the major players are in any particular market. And so putting them in a role where they're a key communication link to both feed information to the DOE emergency response team, plus be the communication liaison, if you will, to the energy industry, was actually, I think, one of the really good recommendations in this study, because they are equipped and knowledgeable. In the past, what happened was they didn't have a formal role in the emergency response team. And so what happened was when these events occurred, they went into their normal collecting data role. Well, that actually requires them to go out and get, through the Paperwork Reduction Act, to get approval to go out and collect data from the industry. That takes time, a couple of days here and there to go through that process, and then they're over collecting data as opposed to situational information. This puts them in the Emergency Response Center, able to reach out directly to the industry and collect the situational information, plus they know who to talk to, and they know how the system operates. So they can be a filter and also a key communication link. Once the DOE has that framework established and the communication link on their side, then it's up to the industry to make the link on the other side. So our commitment is to establish company liaisons directly to provide that situational awareness. This just gives a sort of pictorial. For those of you who might not be familiar, emergency response basically is built on a system called Incident Command System. And it was actually started when firefighters were trying to fight fires way back when in the national forests. And it's been picked up and utilized. It's utilized by your local fire department. It's utilized by your local police. It's utilized for any emergency response at a local area. Similarly, the Coast Guard. And so this is a framework that's well understood and embedded. Your state emergency response centers are built on this framework. So all we're trying to do is leverage that, which is already in place, and provide the links then. So the EOE Emergency Response Centers set up, then the link with the EIA that links to the industry, and the industry then links both to DOE and to the states. One of the other things that's important in these events is getting temporary regulatory relief. And in Superstorm Sandy, actually, this happened really fast. And what this process looks like is a lot of times when an event occurs, the stocks will be not available. They'll either be stuck in a terminal somewhere that they can't get out because they don't have power, or they've disrupted the supply chain and you can't supply the region. So the government can step in and give regulatory relief. It can allow you to supply fuel, which you can put in a car, but doesn't meet the environmental regulation of that particular region. It can allow you to bring in fuel from another place if it gets that regulatory relief. It can allow you to have drivers from other states come in and provide and transport that product. So there's a lot that the governments can do on a very temporary basis to allow that regulatory relief to supply the fuels faster in an event. And but up till now, the EPA waits until the event happens before they actually allow that regulatory relief. So the market impact has to be seen where you're short of fuel in that geographic area before the EPA will act. This study recommends that when we know there's a significant disruption in supply chain, then it asks the EPA to act on a more regional basis rather than waiting for the impact to hit the market when you know it's going to occur in the next few days out in time. A very good example of that is the Colonial Pipeline is a main source of fuel to this region. It starts in the Gulf Coast and it goes all the way up at the East Coast. If there's a problem in the Gulf Coast or a problem with that pipeline, you know in 2, 3, or 4 days it's going to hit Atlanta, Baltimore, or up in this region. So we're asking for the EPA to, knowing that what that supply chain looks like, to act in advance. And we think that will speed things up. At the state level, we're recommending that the state increase their engagement with the oil and gas industry so that we can provide more education to the staff there about what the supply chains look like in their region, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the things that they should realize, and who the contact points are. And also bring the utilities into those conversations so that it's a joint exercise in understanding both sides of the equation. And then it's all about, okay, you've got that system in place, you've got an understanding of the supply chain, the regulatory system will work when it needs to, but how do you sustain it on an ongoing basis? And so the recommendation, again, is not rocket science, but it's about the Department of Energy and the states actually establishing those routine training and education programs. And this means specifically you've got to have budgets and you've got to have people that their role in the organization on an ongoing basis, regardless of whether there's an event or not, is to focus on this, make sure people are trained, they know their role, and they're practicing, which is the last recommendation, that their drill and exercise programs are utilized and really worked. And the oil and natural gas industry, by virtue of basically publishing this report and putting their stamp on it as well through the National Petroleum Council, says we will support coming in the education processes and we will support participating in the drills. All those recommendations are really nice. I told you before, we see the same recommendations a lot of places. It's all about implementation. And so we've moved off of the recommending the findings, and we're focused now on the implementation to really put this in place. Again, I can't speak more positively about the Department of Energy in putting the resources against this, and now talking about actually budgets at the state level to continue the sustainability process in place. So we've got an implementation plan. The DOE has resources put against this, and the National Petroleum Council has put a small team together to carry this forward on implementation. And together, the industry and the Department of Energy have committed to a drill later in the year to test how far along we've gotten in terms of the implementation, and then to continue that on an ongoing basis. So that's really all I had to say.
Good afternoon. Happy we have at least some attendance given the terrible weather. So hopefully we can be of interest and pinpoint what's happening. Oh, okay. Some of the practical questions. What I'm going to do in about 5 or 10 minutes, just to perhaps give a little context to what Peggy has laid out and the significance of what the National Petroleum Council is presenting, is just speak a little bit about my experience when Sandy hit, when I was sitting a couple doors down from Governor Cuomo, and my responsibility was basically senior advisor, and all of a sudden this unprecedented, crazy event starts coming in, and things start pouring in, and people start pouring into my office, and blah, 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 and it's just really a first-of-a-kind event, and it's really a first-of-a-kind issue presented, I think, to most decision makers and policymakers, both at the state and the federal level, because this was really something. And I want to underscore the notion that Peggy was making, that when you look at these or hear these recommendations, you know, let's get a contact between the federal government and the state government that's at an authoritative level so you can get real-time information. You know, let's have a system where you can get regulatory relief. Let's have some look at the resiliency of critical energy assets. If I were sitting where you are, or anybody, I would say, that's pretty basic stuff. Are you kidding me? That wasn't in place already? I mean, what was going on? And these recommendations, these types of ideas have been around since at least 2013. They're now just getting the attention they deserve. I think that's in part the reflection of the fact that you have an emergency. It stops, you get on to other work, and it gets put on the shelf. But so it's very important that these are looked at and implemented, and implementation is really the critical aspect of this. But just for example, talking about getting the right information to the right people at the right time, when we, and in New Jersey and in New York and in the city of New York, wanted to get information about, well, are the terminals, what inventories do the terminals have? What inventories do the retail gas stations have? If they're damaged, how long is it going to take to get them back in place? Do they have a plan? You know, what are the plans of these major infrastructure pieces of getting gasoline, you know, up the coast and into the cars and into the first responders and to everybody who needs it to have the basic economy run? People kind of just started looking at their navels or looking at each other and essentially said, well, I'm going to get out my Rolodex. I'm going to start calling people that I have relationships with and people that maybe call me back, and we'll just start from there. And frankly, that's where we started, much of it. As pedestrian and as chaotic as that sounds, that's the way it was running right up initially. Hence the need for a much more institutionalized system whereby you can get the right information to the right people at the right time. And it's as basic as having a defined list of people, which continues to be updated at the federal government level, at the state level, and in the private sector, who, one, are knowledgeable about what you're trying to seek, and secondly, have authority to take action, you know, if it comes up that they really need to give you an authoritative answer to get a change made. With respect to the question of accelerating waivers and getting fuel from one spot to the other when you're in a real fix and lines are backing up and you're thinking about implementing a rationing scheme, one of the incidents that I was involved in that illustrates the need for institutionalizing, enhancing, and streamlining this, the ability to waive regulations that are in the way of getting quick response, was this. We had a huge supply problem in the New England and in the New York area. So where could we get gasoline into the New York area? Not through the marine system, because that was all clogged up, and you know, wharfs were down. There were things in the water. There was pollution and all that. So you had to get, where can we get stuff by truck? Because that was basically it. The main pipelines, 2 of them were damaged at least for several days and maybe a couple of weeks. So where do you turn? Well, we turned to many places, but one of the most likely places to turn was Boston Harbor. Okay, they were not as impacted, although they were somewhat impacted. They are a huge terminal storage area. They had the ability to, and were getting both imports, and they also were able to get, if we could secure approval to allow certain vessels to go from the Gulf Coast up to Boston, you could take by tanker instead of pipeline product from Louisiana up to Boston. So what's the problem? You know, I call up, you know, I actually got some pretty urgent phone calls from a company called Global International, which is the largest terminal operator in New England. And they said, look, we've got the ability to get some major gasoline down to you. We're ready to go. But there's 2 problems, at least. One, if we can get product into our terminal, we can get it to you, but we have this one problem. There's an environmental regulation that requires when you offload crude or product from a tanker into a terminal that you've got to have something called a vapor recovery system, which is designed to, you know, prevent vapor, VOCs and that kind of stuff, benzene going into the air. Good, terrific regulation. But it just so happens these fellows had never run it that way. They had never been a source of running the product in and down. They were usually running it out. And also in these particular terminals, they just never had to go through a vapor recovery requirement. So the question was, we can't get that stuff to you unless we get that requirement waived. Okay, what's the problem? Well, the Massachusetts Environmental Agency had a say in whether it would be waived or not, and the federal EPA had a say in whether it would be waived or not. It took phone call at, first of all, identifying the people who were responsible for executing the waiver, secondly, talking to those people and understanding from them what requirements they had to grant that waiver. There was, for example, a requirement that under the existing law that they had to make a record for demonstrating that there was a real issue. And in addition to that, there was actually no specific waiver procedure in the law. Some laws provide for waivers, under certain circumstances. In this case, there was no waiver provision. I said, well, you know what we do in that case? I mean, at least what a lawyer would recommend to his client if they had to deal with it, is get the government to give you a no-action commitment. In other words, the government has discretion to enforce laws. They also have discretion not to enforce them. So that was something we talked about, and the industry at first said, well, that's not bad, but that's really not much protection. Because if Massachusetts agrees not to enforce it, it doesn't mean to say that people in the public couldn't enforce it, or anybody else couldn't, bring a suit. So while it's wonderful for you to tell me that the Massachusetts Attorney General is not going to bring a lawsuit, and maybe the U.S. Attorney General lawsuit, we still stand a risk. And we kind of beat them down on that and said, look, this is a national emergency, suck it up, and this is as good as you're going to get, and let's move this baby along. And fortunately, we did get those waivers, but it took a week or so. And then finally, we were able to start that fuel flowing down through Massachusetts. But that wasn't the only problem. Once the trucks got to Connecticut, Connecticut has rules of the road that prohibit any vessel, any truck or traffic that weighs over 100,000 tons or pounds can't go on their roads without an exemption. I said, are you kidding me? I mean, these things weighed a lot more than that. We're trying to run these trucks down. So that was another battle we had to fight with the Department of Transportation federally and with the Connecticut Highway Department to get an exemption from that particular requirement. And finally, we got fuel coming down to us in New York, and it was helpful, but it was late, and that process should never occur again. Hopefully, we can have a system, which is recommended in part by the NPC, that predetermines waivers or changes perhaps the law that requires that, it says you can't have a waiver. Anyway, it takes that system and makes it work in an emergency situation. So that's part of the types of issues we were dealing with. And another major question we had to deal with was trying to get information about the response plans of these terminals and the pipelines, and also to what extent were they damaged, and if they were damaged, how long would it take to get in operation? And that is another area I think that we need to perhaps open up and get more information about and more access to, so that the government can be in a position to intelligently assess the condition of the terminals and the pipelines and proceed to get them in a more resilient state if that is necessary. So the one other major issue that, again, as a practical matter, was very important and is being addressed, at least by the NPC, is the question of the interdependency between power and the oil and gas critical assets. Essentially, the operation of oil and gas critical assets is dependent on a power source. There were major power outages in the Northeast and in the New York area, and much of what happened and slowed down this fuel supply was simply the grid going down and terminals not being able to operate their truck racks, or pumps not operating on pipelines. You got to pump that stuff up, and they run electrically, at least now, most of them. And therefore, there's a very important issue as to when and how will a utility like Con Ed or PSE&G restore power to an oil and gas operating critical asset. Well, it turns out that the utilities have agreed and mandated restoration priorities as to whom they're going to go to first, second, third, and fourth. And before Sandy, the oil and gas sector and that kind of thing, which had never really been considered a major critical asset because you'd never had such a disruption like this, was basically at the bottom of the list. So you had 4 or 5 other types of facilities, important ones, hospitals, first responders, that the utilities were focusing on to restore power to. And so we're sitting there trying to get fuel, and the utilities aren't trying to restore power to the places that serve it. Not a good thing. So we pushed them hard to try to accelerate that and get that restoration priority changed. Actually, it has been changed now in New Jersey and New York. But the other just piece of that, and then I'm going to stop, is knowing that, being aware of that interdependency between the fuel supply chain and power, it would make sense for the oil and gas sector itself to consider having some backup power, some kind of a system itself where it could, if the grid went down, it could support itself at least for a reasonable amount of time and be able to function. In that case, and what happened in Sandy again was, in some cases, where the power was restored up to the fence line, because of the massive surge, the unprecedented storm surge, most of the electrical equipment, wiring at, let's say, terminals and some pipeline operations was totally destroyed by the surge. So even getting the power to the line, these guys couldn't operate because they didn't have a working system on site. Again, an issue, an interdependency, something that the NPC is, I think, correctly focusing on. If we know that's an interdependency, we know it's a risk, it should be addressed in some way or other. So that's just to give a few examples maybe of, practically speaking, what's faced. And as Peggy points out, it's implementation of these requirements that's going to be the key. Because there is no, right now, mandatory requirement just for oil and gas industry to report specifically real-time information on their inventories to the public sector, okay? I'm just saying that's a fact. So if that's not there, if there's no regulatory requirement for that, then you have to rely on relationships, you have to rely on, trust, and hopefully, I think in terms of the recommendation in the NPC, we can now rely on a commitment from the industry that they're going to, do that and try to institutionalize a system, which will be, quote, voluntary in a certain sense, although implementation can take many forms, but we'll set up a system where it's an institutionalized approach as opposed to just there's nothing there and you kind of throw up your hands and try to do what you can do. Same kind of situation applies with respect to resiliency of critical assets. There is really no mandatory requirement, at least based on our research, certainly at the federal level, and I don't think in any state in the country, maybe one, again, for oil and gas companies to do vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, and then consider options for increasing the resiliency of their facilities. Now, I'm not advocating for or against that. I'm just saying that's where you are. So given that and given the need to enhance their resilience, again, the NPC is, I think, putting on the table some approaches where industry will be more directly involved in that and maybe more focused on it. And also, of course, the industry has a built-in incentive, obviously, to do that. They want to keep running. They want to make profit. They want to sell product. And but that kind of incentive varies with the economy and other things. But in any event, those are just some thoughts about and focus on some of the practical issues here and the importance of what the NPC is recommending and the vital importance of implementing it quickly and effectively. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both Peggy and Bob for those fantastic presentations. The experiences, sort of practical experiences of having had to deal with Superstorm Sandy is just, I think, part of why this issue has such resonance in this area and just shows the difficulties of trying to figure out these complicated supply chain questions on the fly and the importance of the work that you've done here for the NPC study. We'll do a few questions with both Peggy and Bob here, and we'll try and leave some time so that we can take some from the audience as well. But one of the things that struck me, Bob, as you were talking through the sort of experiences that you had there, and this question for both of you is that if the some of the specific ways that if the NPC study recommendations were in place at that time, or if an event like that happened now, like how the response might be different in either better or worse. Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, I can give some quickly, and then you can. As I indicated, the first question for you and the second and third question is, what is the status of the fuel supply that we need in this state right now? So and again, there's a difference between going through your Rolodex and calling just anybody you can get on the phone and then getting people called back, obviously, and having an institutionalized system which will be sustainable, where if that happens again, my team has the list of people who are at Colonial Pipeline, at DOE, at Buckeye Pipeline, at Northfield Terminals, if we want to go into the detail, and there's a person that's been designated and is there and has the responsibility to answer, they'll have an institutionalized chain of command and chain of communication. And also, it's got to also involve, though, people on the other end of the phone who either have the authority to act or have direct access to somebody with authority to act, because otherwise it's going to waste too much time. The second piece of it is there's got to be a coordinated approach to this at the federal level and the state level, by which I mean, particularly at the state level, oftentimes, it's true in New York, I think it's somewhat true in New Jersey, you've got a split kind of authority and responsibility for responding to emergencies in general and specifically energy emergencies. For example, in New York State, there's the Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, and there's the Department of, and there's NYSERDA, and there's an energy official who's responsible for energy. Who takes the lead on that? Who's talking to whom? That institutional dichotomy has to be harmonized, and there has to be a very clear authority at the state level, again, because we don't want to end up calling 2 or 3 people 3 or 4 times. That's annoying, and plus it wastes time. And the same thing needs to be done at the federal level. They've got to designate exactly who it is who's going to be responsible for this. So I think all of those points, I think, are part of your institutionalized, sustainable communication system. So I think it would be very different, at least in terms of getting the government, the information it think it needs.
Yeah, the way I'd respond is I actually think I'm pretty pleased with what's happening at the state level, particularly in this region. So we participated earlier today with some key people from different government agencies in both at the city level and at the state level, and I think there's a lot of work that's been put in place because of Superstorm Sandy that brings the collective body together, both the government and the industry and the utilities, to know each other, to do the planning and contingency, and to do the drills and activities that are needed to keep it sustainable. So I was pretty pleased with what I saw and heard about that. And I think this study adds to it by actually improving the coordination between the federal government and the states. That I think was missing in Superstorm Sandy, and there was frustration also about the level of information that was coming from the industry and what the situation was, and the report really tries to address that. So I think those for me are the 2 major places. The recommendations on regulatory relief, you gave a good one, Bob, on the marine vapor recovery, but for the most part, just the nature of the size of the event with Superstorm Sandy, actually the regulatory relief generally came faster than what I've seen in other events. That said, there's still the opportunity for the improvement there in terms of speed of action and decision making.
Yeah, just on that point, I think I would agree at the federal level it was faster. I think when we were involved in trying to deal with multiple states and multiple local jurisdictions, it was anything but fast. in the sense, I mean, everybody tried to cooperate, but they all had to go up the chain, and it was new, and you had to look, you know how things are when they're the first time, and people don't want to step out. But I think that's improving substantially, and I think everybody with well intentions, but it just was a tough hurdles to go through the first time.
Picking up a bit from your answer there, Peggy, of talking about the sort of the improved coordination between federal government and the state, and the improved sort of performance of the federal government that's in the recommendations. One of the key ones is about the role for the Energy Information Administration, for EIA to play. And you talked about the importance of that, why they have unique knowledge that can be brought to bear if they're incorporated better into the system. Can you talk a little bit about, like, what are the hurdles to that recommendation being implemented? Are these things that DOE is already doing to correct? Does this require any legislative fix? Are there additional resources that are required there?
No, I think this is actually a really key recommendation, and one that will make a big difference, and surprisingly relatively easy to implement. So the EIA is very supportive of this. In reality, what was limiting them before was they were actually not authorized. That wasn't their role. They did not have a formal role in the Emergency Response Center. They didn't have resources, and they didn't have budgets to actually do that work. They were not chartered to ever do that work. And they're also in a position where they can provide information, but they can't participate in policy or decision-making. And somewhere along the line, the DOE Emergency Response Team will have to get into that. And so we just have to divorce. They're the information feeder, if you will, but they can't actually get involved in any policy kind of decisions. So it was just about clarifying their role, making it formal, and getting them trained as part of the Emergency Response Center. Relatively easy, but just had never really been thought about in terms of a really good way to reach out into to the industry. So that one, I'm really pleased to see how far it's moving along in terms of implementation, and I do think it'll make a big difference.
Could I just want to make a comment? I don't want to get too far in the weeds on EIA. I think you're absolutely right that you can draw a new role for it. I think, however, there may be some significant restrictions legally on what it can do and how it can provide information in terms of, let's say, real-time facility-specific information. As I understood it during Sandy, well, their normal operating approach is that they've got about 60 forms,
Yeah, they're not going to do that.
Yeah, but when Sandy hit, that was the thing. So I'm looking through the form. Let's see, where's the one for the real time? And we don't have one. What do we do? So what they did, and although it took a few, maybe more than a couple of weeks, the real process was to take the form, you mark it up, and you give it to the Office of Management and Budget, and 60 days later you might get back some comments in a new form. Well, obviously that's silly in this context. They were able, because we actually had some discussions. Jason was in the White House. I was back and forth with him and other people and said, this baby's going to go through quickly. So they were able to get the form changed. But the form, as I understand it, that they finally were able to get approved was not one that would allow real-time information to be gathered or distributed. It was helpful. It was useful to, put a lot of information together and give you some agglomerated figures about what was going on in parts of the New England and parts of New York. But it wasn't, again, from the state's point of view, from the politicians' point of view, it wasn't the kind of information that we thought we needed anyway to get there. So I think EIA has a great role to play. I just think there may be some constraints that need to be addressed, either legally or change their regulations or whatever.
Yeah, no, the process envisioned here is different than that process. That was the normal process, again, going through the Paperwork Reduction Act, getting approvals to send out surveys and all that. But having a formal role in the Emergency Response Center gives them the ability to not have to do that as a way of collecting information. And the liaisons actually give them a direct conduit to the companies rather than just sending out forms and getting data.
Okay, well, yeah, we're gonna look at that, and that's great. That's terrific. That certainly should be the objective, and I hope it works that way. Great.
So I was going to ask one more question of you all, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So we have the microphone in the middle. Folks can feel free to make your way up there if you have any questions. And I just wanted to follow up on that, the real-time data question, right? Because it's without a regulatory requirement to provide it. We talked about how there's going to be this sort of voluntary effort, that strikes me as potentially incredibly business-sensitive information that companies would be asked to share their, I guess, the sort of what agreement do we have from the industry, or like, how, if it's a voluntary agreement for folks to share what is this potentially very sensitive business information, what confidence, should we have that it will in fact happen when appropriate?
And that's another reason why we've got the EIA in the position that we do in this study, because indeed we operate as an industry under very significant antitrust regulations, and we can't share data either with competitors or in the wider stance. And so that is a different regulatory environment than utilities that can get together and talk about where they are and what they need to do collectively. The EIA is a very trusted agency who collects data already from us, and they can synthesize it, aggregate it, and make sense out of it to report back. And the industry doesn't have a concern about communicating to the EIA sort of where they are and what they do. That is standard. And so that's another way of allowing the information flow direct because of the regulatory environment. But it is more one-on-one, and it isn't getting the community together so they can talk about what the state of the situation is because of the regulatory environment that we operate in.
Just because of the importance of this, you might think, what are you doing about data? I just want to, ask Peggy or just point out the fact that there are other business restraints on what information, at least they were, an operator can reveal, like a terminal operator, for example. As Peggy said in her opening remarks, many people were under the impression if a terminal's got oil or gasoline in it, they can tell you how much you got, where's it going, where's it coming from. Well, that's not the case if they don't own it, because they have contracts with their customers who own that oil, and the owners are the ones that have the right to authorize any release of that information or get into any detail that's really interesting. So how do you cut through that? What's up there? In terms of the.
And again, I hate to sound like this is like the silver bullet, but the EIA knows who the major market players are in that market, and then with a call list they'll know who to contact because that's how they collect data. They collect data from the people in that specific geographic region, and that's how their databases are built. So they're well aware of who the market players are in the market and who are the right guys to call. And even though, for instance, Shell doesn't own all the Shell retail stations that have the brand on it, we would still know, because we're responsible for supplying it from the production, refining through the pipeline system, we will still know the status of that supply chain, even though we don't own the physical assets that are moving those products around. So by virtue of calling on a few people, I think you can get that knowledge base of what the supply chain looks like and where are the issues.
So that's really a good point, and it's a good way to go. And then it seems to me then that emphasizes or makes even more important the flow of communication from the EIA to the states and the local people, because if that's the only place they're going to get that information.
Well, it's also incumbent upon the states to know what those supply chains look like. So, how important is Colonial? Who are the major terminal operators? And that's why we're recommending the education at the state level with the industry engagement, so that there's an understanding of how the system works and who are the major players in that system.
Just curious if there's any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Stacey Elmer. I'm actually finishing my MPA here, but I was at the White House during Hurricane Sandy in the Resilience Policy Directorate. I just, first of all, want to say I think you guys have done a great job at implementing some recommendations that are absolutely necessary for improving things that happened during Sandy. One of my questions boils down to the liaisons in the industry. One of the things I learned through my experiences in disaster preparedness is systems that work best in an emergency are those that are utilized on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's great to have liaisons who are named and who know their role, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, and I also think exercises are great, but they're also limited in sort of their timing and capacity to actually be utilized regularly. If you could talk a little bit more about how we can better integrate industry liaisons into sort of the federal process and state processes so that we build those relationships in a way that can be utilized quickly and in a trustworthy way during a disaster. And then just a second question I have for you is actually about sort of the role of innovation in this system. And so one of the things I learned from Sandy was that when we couldn't find gas or we didn't know where it was, we actually ended up relying on citizens who were tweeting out where open gas stations were to, a tech company who'd created a map for us. So I was wondering if you had thought much about how you can adapt our systems to be flexible and actually integrate innovative practices during a response, because no matter how well we do here in New York this time, the next disaster is going to bring something completely different to the industry. It's going to be somewhere else. And having that flexibility, I think, is something we often lack in the federal government. So I was wondering if you could just address maybe both of those.
Yeah, no, thanks for the questions. Great questions. In terms of the industry engagement, I think it's one of those things where you talked about trusted relationships, and that's indeed what it comes down to. But you get those trusted relationships through the drills and through what we're seeing at the state levels and the local levels are these council groups that are coming together to talk about their preparation, who the contact points are, and then getting back together to say, okay, what did we learn and what do we have to improve? So we see that those coordination bodies actually working out pretty well in the states. But I think from an industry perspective, the information flow is a highly sensitive one, and so it's still one of those. What we're looking for in the liaisons is we're not looking for the expert that's for that particular facility. What we're looking for is to connect to the people who are responsible for running the entire supply chain and have that overview of the system so they know where the issues are, rather than connecting them straight to a refinery who might be down. It's who is the person in that particular company that has that broader overview and is actually at a higher level and a decision-making level to provide the right level of information. And that's the type of individual that we're looking for in terms of these liaisons, that have a broader perspective and are dealing with the issues, the people that will go and seek out the regulatory relief or know that the supply chain is going to be empty in 2 or 3 days at this particular city. So that's the level of knowledge and expertise that we're looking for to be these company liaisons, and people that are not directly related to boots on the ground, but somebody that has a broader perspective and is actually a little bit away from the fray of the emergency on the ground, but is dealing with the wider issues and removing the regulatory barriers and doing the coordination and communication. So that's the kind of role that we see that liaison playing. And it'll vary in some of the major companies. It's really the people who deal with the supply chain. In some of the smaller companies, it's a key operational, the head of operations or something like that. So we're defining that role for the trade organizations. We're actually going out through the trade organizations to get their memberships, but defining that role and what that expertise looks like will be an important one, so that we get that right level of information. Back to your point on innovation, we didn't tackle this in the study, and we did see some things, particularly even at the federal level, that they're putting in place where you know, the utilities have done a great job on this. Where you can look on their website at any, I guess if you have the website, if it's working during the emergency, but you can look and see at any point in time sort of how many customers they have out, what their systems are or are not. Again, the industry in the oil and gas side is not going to put out that competitively sensitive information out there, but there's some work being done by the federal government to have applications that show where the nearest gasoline station is that's up and running. I don't know if how the gasoline station feels about that because they might get inundated. But the way I look at it for innovation is it's a really key piece around that communication and coordination. But I think for us in the study, the first part was just getting the basics in place, operating and sustained, and then you can implement innovation on top of that. But until you get the basic infrastructure, so we didn't go down that route, but I think it will be useful over time. But just wasn't something we took on this time.
Peggy, I just wanted to follow up on your description of the liaisons and their function, and just maybe clarify. So I understand the level of person that you're putting in place. Does that mean that the nature of the information that's expected to be communicated is aggregated and not industry, not facility and real-time specific? Or is that something that could be done by, it's going to be done, it's just you're just doing it at that level?
I think it is more aggregated on purpose initially, I think. But
I certainly understand the reason for that.
The intent is to be able to feed in what are the critical pieces that you need to know, where are the issues.
Okay, and that is always, that's a discussion that kind of goes on, or at least it's a good discussion to continue to have as to what is the critical information, what information do you need, and I know there's probably some difference of opinion as to who needs what and why.
Yes.
So, so that's a good area to explore. Okay.
Hi, my name is John Harms. I'm with the American Waterways Operators for the National Trade Association of the Tugboat and Barge Industry. We represent about 350 maritime operators nationwide, including several dozen on the East Coast and some right here in New York Harbor. I want to thank you, first of all, for a very comprehensive report. This is a very serious problem, obviously, and we had dozens of ships right here and tugs and barges right here in the harbor during Hurricane Sandy that were unable to load. Going back to the storm and in the immediate aftermath, there were Jones Act waivers granted for that allowed foreign operators, foreign ships, to come in and operate in the domestic trades. Seeing as the waiver process worked as expected and about as good as was needed during the Hurricane Sandy event, I was wondering why one of the main recommendations in the report is to broaden that waiver process.
The primary reason that it's in there was, frankly, the waiver process worked really well in Superstorm Sandy, including Jones Act, because it came from the White House and said, go ahead and do this. In a normal emergency event, there's no well-understood process to actually get a Jones Act waiver. What information do you have to provide? Who actually is in a position to make the waiver? And it is a tortuous, not transparent process relative to some of the other waivers. So that's the reason that it's in there. It's not well understood, and there's no public record of how to actually get one.
Right.
It's not political either, is it?
No,
the waiver, Jones Act.
Well, you know, the process has been around since 1920, and I think, you know, there are dozens of waivers that have been granted over the last few decades, so it can't be that difficult to navigate, especially when it happens so often. But again, the rest of the report we think is very well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have one. We'll take one more question and then go. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So the assumption around, so I again echo everyone's comments about it. Very well done. Love some of the suggestions in the report. Is the assumption one of the guiding principles is to allow industry to be more effective by removing some of the regulatory restrictions, or is there an assumption for government to drive the solution? So I guess I'm trying to understand exactly what some of the problems were. So for us, for example, I happen to work for a retailer, providing for relief so that a carrier can cross state lines without hurdles is huge and provides for speed. I would throw out, so we had in some cases police escorts because you have very narrow lanes that are available and you need help getting people to where they are. Carriers end up sitting in line for hours. They get paid by the mile. They don't get paid by the hour. So, you know, they are trying to be as efficient as possible. So everyone's looking for efficiency here. But I was just trying to see if the study felt that industry was doing its job in trying to serve the customer and you're trying to assist with them, or is there a feeling that government needs to be more involved in directing the flow of gasoline, of whatever asset, diesel?
Yeah, I think that, and somebody mentioned, I think it might have been Bob, I mean, the industry is incentivized to get product to the customer. That's the business that we're in, is to make sure that that happens. The industry generally is proactive in seeking those waivers when they know the issues are either already on them or they see it coming. And so the report actually tries to say, well, what can be done to speed up that process in terms of understanding the situation, which is incumbent upon industry to bring that forward, and then what can be done in terms of clear authorities and speed around making it happen. And in the case of regulatory relief, trying to actually give the capability to give that relief ahead of the event actually already has happened. So a little bit of both on both sides, but probably a little bit more on federal and state.
Because we currently, so states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia are currently under states of emergency from the various snowstorms. Right. That generally doesn't enhance the movement of product or make it easier, faster to get product to customers. There are a number of restrictions with states of emergencies that add to the complications around doing that. So the industry in general, when states of emergency are called, there are concerns. There's obviously processes. It becomes a slower process, just in general now.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of things that we would like for those emergency operations centers at the state level to kind of take those things on, but it needs industry engagement, and that's certainly one of the recommendations is for us to participate in the drills and the exercises, but also get that kind of information to them so that the things can get worked out on a better basis, because it's in everybody's best interest.
I would be assured, we've been having these people at our forums, that the states and the city of New York and other local jurisdictions are doing, I think, it's high priority to get those waiver processes and those kinds of things. One, identified, what you're talking about, if it's getting worse, that's ridiculous, that shouldn't happen, that should be changed tomorrow. But pre-approving or predetermining waiver language, getting those babies on the shelf so you can pull them right off. Secondly, the information exchange, which is being focused on by all of us, will very much assist people responsible for granting waivers to be in a position to do it. Because one of the problems has been, at least when the uneducated situation, and this happened with EPA, is that if you don't get waiver requests very much and there's no institutionalized, once you get one, you say, oh my God, look what I have to do. I need all this information about the background and baseline and stuff, and it takes a month to get it. Whereas if you have that on your schedule as something that needs to be prepared for, you'll already have that information or a system to get it like that, and therefore the process will move ahead. So there's plenty that can be done, and I think plenty that is being done. But the kind of thing, if you have examples of where an emergency declaration makes it more, lengthy to get a waiver, get that information to whoever in the governor's office should have it, and they should deal with it. That just shouldn't happen. Anyway.
Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. everyone. And thank you again to Bob for all the work that you've done along the way on this resilience issue in the tri-state area, and Peggy for coming to present the report to us and your fantastic work in pulling it together. We look forward to continue our discussions on some of these infrastructure and resilience issues here at the center. And thank you all for coming out this evening.